Season 5 of The Dragon Prince appears to be a season defined by mystery. The promo images that we have seen thus far seem quite mysterious, evoking some conception of the romantic sublime in the Burkean sense, this vast immensity that is both thrilling and terrifying, both threatening to completely dissolve the self and providing this sense of immensity and vast expansiveness. The known, the familiar, the repetitive, the routine are torn asunder. Hopefully, the season itself can bring some of that energy, some of that romantic sublime intensity. I do not simply mean in terms of the plot. I do not have a lot of doubts that the plot will be able to measure up to that promise of mystery. There are going to be revelations in this season. Likely more revelations than there were in Season 4. If Season 4 felt to some like a half of a season, Season 5 will be the other half. The missing pieces that interact with what we have already seen in Season 4 to create a kind of dyad. A 2-season diptych portraying Claudia's attempts to revive Aaravos and Callum and company's attempts to stop her. There will be a whole cavalcade of mysteries unveiled, uncertainties revealed. But what I am most interested in are the mysteries that apply tension to the show from a character perspective, from a thematic perspective, from a psychological perspective. The Dragon Prince needs to assert what these characters are moving toward, especially Callum. What does Callum want? What is he trying to achieve? There are certain answers here, like he wants to stop Aaravos, which, sure, why not? But that's a plot motivation. And like a lot of plot motivations, it's an excuse. I don't mean an excuse or conceit in the innately negative sense in the word. I don't mean that it's bad that Callum is going after Aaravos. I simply mean that these plot-centric conflicts exist as a framework or foundation or background upon which the higher conflicts, the conflicts of character, of ideas and tensions and passions and yearnings and laments, lie. And those conflicts are the important ones. Those conflicts are the ones that form the foundation of the narrative. Callum is in a position wherein he, and I believe Season 4 was right on this front, he is deracinated a bit from the too facile and too superficial conclusions that he arrived at in the first 3 seasons of the show. At the end of Season 3, he has an optimistic belief about the future, bolstered by his relationship with Rayla, bolstered by his victory over Viren, bolstered by the fact that his life seems to be going in a direction he considers right and appropriate. These bursts of optimism that flow through Callum are not innately wrong, but they are too simple. They are too abstract. He clings to an idea of himself in the world that is fundamentally unstable. Sartre talks about the fallacy of attempting to commit yourself wholeheartedly to a single limiting role or idea or self-concept. The most famous example Sartre provides, as I've mentioned in previous videos, is the waiter who commits himself so fully to the role of being a waiter that he views that not just as a job, but falsely as a summation of his sense of self. But of course, this is ridiculous. We cannot contain the turbulent, wild energies and passions of our psyche, many of which we do not even understand or comprehend within the framework of a job. But we also can't contain them within any framework. Sartre's waiter provides an example of how ridiculous this is, but for Sartre, this kind of thing, acting in bad faith, not intentionally, but in the sense of trying to reduce the pluralistic and vast and multiplicitous concepts of ourselves into these very narrow definitions, is something that we all do. They're wrong because they rely on abstractions, and because our senses of self are inevitably connected to a changing world of impressions, a world that is always in the process of flux, we ourselves are always changing, at least bit by bit, piece by piece. These changes are not always good or bad. Many of them are neutral, but they fundamentally erode the idea of having a single, solitary sense of self. Callum believes he has that at the end of Season 3, and Season 4 threatens that to a certain extent. Season 4 does a lot in that regard, but Season 5 could do even more. It could go further. Season 5 could have Callum be tempted. He could fundamentally have a crisis of faith, a crisis of identity. He could fundamentally understand that his chipper belief in himself and his belief in Rayla and his belief in the optimism of the world are not as solid as he wants to believe. Aaravos could perhaps tempt him in this direction, and I do hope Season 5 does more with the dynamic of Aaravos tempting Callum, because that is one of the most fertile and interesting dynamics the show has set up thus far. Aaravos, if he does this, would not be concocting these tensions and these anxieties ex nihilo. Rather, he would be fundamentally amplifying how Callum already feels, these anxieties that already exist within his basic sense of self. His relationship with Rayla is not on the strongest ground. They have not fixed the underlying tensions causing them so much strife, the tensions that caused Rayla to leave in the first place. And Callum is not who he once was. He is not that optimistic kid. He has gone through so much loss and grief. In terms of Rayla, yes, but also in terms of his loss of his innocence, or what remained of it. He is plunged fully into a more cynical and more fragmented world that is difficult to figure out. It's easy to say, okay, let's beat Viren. It's much harder to try to patch together a world that has been fractured by 1,000 years of conflict. Callum understands that, and he feels that grief, and he needs to deal with it. Not in the sense that he can arrive at a pat and tidy resolution, but in the sense that he understands that he can't. Aaravos, while acting on his own whims and his own ideals, might be an appropriate vehicle for forcing Callum to go through with those very harsh and bitter reflections. Those temptations might ultimately be beneficial to Callum. No, I'm not saying he has to completely fall victim to those temptations, and based on the person he has been thus far in the show, I doubt that he would completely fall victim to them, but he needs to be tempted. This is the fundamental Hegelian dynamic, which is very applicable to narrative storytelling. We start with an abstraction. We start with these idealistic beliefs in the fundamental goodness of oneself and one's values and the fundamental harshness and injustice of the world. And this isn't wrong necessarily, but it's too simple. And because that initial optimism is built on such a poor and flimsy foundation, it is inevitably overwhelmed, leading to a crisis of faith, a crisis of identity. And that darkness, that side of the world that is rejected, harsh, bitter, selfish, cold, but also right and grounded in a broader conception of how the world actually works than the initial perspective of the idealist, has an effect on the protagonist that is negative, perhaps, but ultimately helps the protagonist arrive at a kind of synthesis. The famed Hegelian synthesis, a intermixture between the cynical wisdom of the harsh material world and the initial idealistic fantasies. And thus, the hero grows from being uncertain and naive to having a strong, worldly, expansive sense of self. I hope Callum can go on this journey. Fingers crossed for him. So anyway, thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos just like this one before anyone else. I really like Callum, and I hope that Season 5 treats him with the complexity that he deserves, really challenging him. Not overwhelming him, perhaps, but forcing him to reconsider himself. So anyway, tune in soon for my next analysis. It will be coming soon. Promise you that. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.